but we're going to start talking about listening to the community. And here's where this comes from, right? We're talking about being a people that goes out to the community, right, and engages with the community. And originally, when Trey and I were building out this missionary pathway process, we had one session called Engage with Your Community. What's the problem with that? If you tell people to engage with the community, what are they going to do? They're going to go engage with the community, but we're going to do the things we think the community needs, right? Instead of going into the community and getting to know what the community actually needs. So you can't engage with the community until you learn to listen to the community. Because if you don't listen to the community or actually get out there and experience it, all your preconceived ideas about the community are going to be what you use to try to create these great things for the community. But what if all your preconceived ideas are wrong? Right? So, quick story as we get into this. One of my bucket list items in life was to visit Canada and eat poutine. I have very high aspirations in life, okay? So I start connecting with James and Leonardo in our first session, and one of the things we do in the session is we have this form that everybody fills out, and it drops where everybody lives onto a big map around the world, so we can see where people are at that are doing this training. And I saw that James and Leonardo were in Vancouver, and I was like, tell me more, right? I'm like, this is so cool. And so I asked James, I'm like, how much does it snow there? Because I'm thinking Canada. And when I think about Canada, farther north than where I currently live, I have a picture of the Arctic, right? And it snows all the time, and there's 2 weeks of what we would call summer. And then you go back to the snow, right? And James looks at me and he goes, I don't know, like twice a year? I was like, what? And I was like, tell me more. He's like, no, man, we're on the coast. It's like Seattle here. Like, it's beautiful. I come out here, it's warmer here right now than it is where I live in New Jersey. It's gorgeous. Like, it just blew me away. And then as I drive around with James all day yesterday, and I'm getting to see different aspects of Canada, it was amazing to me because I didn't have the same cultural dissonance that I usually feel when I traveled somewhere else, like the first time we went to Europe, or the first time we went to Israel or Panama, right? I was like, man, if I did not know where I was, I would think I was in America, right? So much feels so similar. But like, I didn't know any of that stuff. And because I didn't know that, if James were to look at me and go, what's something we could do to like reach people in the community? I'd be like, you should start a snowmobiling club. Everybody does that, right? That would have been very wrong. Right, get some poutine, start a snowmobiling club, it'd be good. So the point of that is this. Until we take time to be in a place and understand a place, we really don't know how to share the gospel with that place, right? But when we spend time in that place and we get to know that place and we get to know the people around it, sharing the gospel becomes a lot more obvious than what we realize. Sometimes it becomes common sense and simple. And I know you don't believe me, so I'll give you one more example, and we'll talk about this section. When I first went to Knoxville, and we were going to start the church, we started doing things that people around us said was very outside the box. We would go out and do craft beer festivals. We would advertise on a hard rock radio station. We started our church in the middle of the movie theater, and my favorite was we'd be a couple years into church, and there were still some very sweet older ladies at my planting church that were like, so when are you going to become a church? I was like, technically we already are. We're just in a movie theater. My first 2 children were baptized in a Regal Cinemas. It was awesome. And so we're doing all this really weird outside the box stuff, and people are going, this is so weird and outside the box. To me, it felt like common sense. Do you know why? Because before I set foot in Knoxville, I knew that I wanted to try and reach, as my hard target, a 24 to 34-year-old male disconnected from church. And now all of a sudden you're like, oh, that makes sense. Because where's a 24 to 34-year-old male hanging out? The Brew Festival, the 5K run, right? They're comfortable going to the movie theater because they're disconnected from church. They probably haven't walked in a church, but they've walked in a movie theater quite a bit, right? So that was an in-between space. What kind of music are they listening to? There were a whole bunch. In fact, my radio station wasn't the top radio station, but it was the top radio station among 24 to 34-year-old males, especially disconnected from church. And so all of a sudden people are like, oh, that just makes a lot of sense, right? When you start with the people you're trying to reach, and you take some time to listen to them, and you ask some really simple questions, like, what do they read? What do they listen to? Where do they hang out? Where do they work? Where do they play? What are some of the things they care about? Like, you start to ask these questions, and all of a sudden, outreach and getting to know your community becomes so much easier because it's like the answers were already there to begin with. We just had to take some time to kind of listen and look at what God's trying to show you. So when we're talking about listening to the community, and we're starting here before we engage, there's 3 really important things you need to do to listen to the community. Are you ready? You need to do this. Listen, listen, and listen. Right? I totally stole this from Trey. He's the first one that said it. And I think the first time I heard it, we were actually doing a teaching video together. And so he said that, and I think my jaw dropped. You probably see that in the video. I was like, what? Yeah, we need to just listen. I'll remember sitting in a board meeting one time, and the guy at my board meeting said, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth. So he probably wants you to listen more than you talk. Right? So what do? Well, when we talk about that, we mean this. You need to listen more than you talk, which feels very hypocritical for the person speaking right now, right? But really, that's how we begin. And in fact, I was walking with a church through Phoenix through this, and there's another guy on the call, incredibly extroverted, like me. And he says, you know what I do? I said, what? He goes, I had to learn, because I always like to talk and I always like to jump in. He said, I learned to listen till I'm actually physically uncomfortable. Like, sometimes that's how much we should listen. Till we want to jump in so badly to share something. Maybe keep listening a little more. This is like we were talking about last night, why I think introverts are set up so well for sharing faith, because there's some introverts that are just really good at listening, right? And the more you listen to people, the more they realize you care about them. Because the more you get to know somebody, the more it shows your care, but the more they also want to get to know you, right? So listen more than you talk, and you'll start to learn more about people. The other key thing is this. Listen to learn, not to respond. Sometimes we aren't able to listen because we're so busy thinking about the next thing we're going to say that we actually don't listen to the words coming out of somebody's mouth. That's why in counseling, a lot of times, the best tool they teach you is what's called reflexive listening. And do you know what reflexive listening is? It's simply listening to what somebody says, and before you talk, repeating back to them what they said. And the reason you do that is because it gives them an opportunity to say, yes, that's what I'm saying, or no, that's not what I'm saying, I'm actually saying this. But in that process of listening, if I told you the first thing you have to do when you talk to somebody is just repeat back what they said, what are you going to do? You're going to listen much more closely, right? You're going to listen to learn and not to respond. The other reason this is really huge is sometimes the thing somebody's talking to you about is not really the thing they want to talk about. Have you ever experienced that before? Right? That happens. Right? It happens a lot with people. And in fact, this is where we were talking about something earlier. Sometimes people will throw out spiritual questions to you, right? And sometimes you feel like they're softball questions, or maybe they're questions you feel like you already know the answer to. And so what do you want to do? You want to share the answer, right? You're like, oh, I already know the answer to that. I'll tell you the answer. I had this seminary professor one time who told us this story. I'll never forget it. He was working out with this guy at the gym, and they would always see each other, and so they struck up conversations. And one time this guy started asking him a lot of spiritual questions. And so my seminary professor, being a seminary professor with a doctorate, in theology and theological things, starts firing off answers. And he could start seeing that the guy was starting to get very frustrated with that. And then he stopped and he thought about it for a second. Because I think they were talking about a lot of stuff that had to do with like the Trinity. And he realized, oh, this guy was asking questions that the church spent 400 years wrestling with and figuring out how to address and answer. And he was firing off answers like it was super simple stuff, when in reality it's something the church had been wrestling with for 400 years before they had really good language they could put around it. Like, sometimes where we are misses the process of where somebody's going. And so even looking at somebody and just saying, that's a really great question, like almost validates the question they have, instead of making them think, oh, I should have known the answer to that one, right? The other reason it's so important is whenever somebody asks you a question, even if it's a super softball spiritual question, always follow up with a question. And you may be saying, why do I do that? Because if you follow up with another question, you show them, number one, that you really care about them and what they're asking you. And then the second thing that does is it allows you to better understand what question they're really asking. Because sometimes the same question can have multiple right answers, right? Like, for example, somebody asks you a theological question, why would a good God allow bad things to happen to good people, right? And we feel like I could throw out a couple good answers to that, right? But what if you followed up with a question? And all of a sudden, you found out, man, this has a much deeper layer than what I realized, right? Like, think about how you would actually answer that. And then think you follow up with me with that question. Like, oh, why does a good God allow bad things to happen to bad people? Or good people? And then you say, oh, that's a really good question. Why do you ask? Oh, because I just found out I have cancer. And I've been living my life really well. And so why is this happening to me? And my boss, who's a jerk, just got a perfect health resume. Well, this is a much different conversation than what I thought, right? Oh, that's a really good question. Why do you ask? Because you know what? I think all this faith stuff's kind of bogus. And if your God's really that great, why would he allow stuff like that to happen? Well, this is a very different trajectory, right? You're going to talk to the person with cancer differently than you're going to talk to the person that's like, I want to challenge this a little deeper, right? And so sometimes that second question, even if it's just a second question, opens up layers that allow you to really understand where the conversation's going. But then two, all of a sudden that person doesn't feel like they're just getting some stock answer. They feel like you really care about them as an individual and why they would care about that. Or maybe they just simply feel like they're validated in having the question. Like, one of the biggest things we would do when we planted the church was we would always just tell people, it's okay to have questions. Faith is not about having it all figured out. And that is one of the most freeing things ever for people. Because oftentimes we think what? Faith is about having it all figured out. But when you realize that you can have questions and you can dig into those questions, it really deepens the relationship. And that really allows you to grow in faith in a totally different way. So listen to learn and not to respond. And then finally, listen to show them that you care, which we kind of just hit, right? Listen to show them that you care. So always begin here. And then as you're listening in the community, this is going to be kind of a helpful thing. It's like, well, what are we listening for? Well, you're listening to learn about your community, right? And in any community, any people group, you're going to find three things. You're going to find things that are good, you're going to find things that are broken, and you're going to find things that are redeemable. So, like, that's the amazing thing about the gospel. The gospel and the Christian faith is the only truly world religion. And you may be saying to yourself, what about the other ones? Well, Christianity, if you look at the map of where Christianity is now, it's literally divided pretty evenly across the world. And the reason for that is Christianity is about word and sacrament, right? We're good Lutherans. That's what it means to be Lutheran, word and sacrament. Well, that is the most contextually simple thing that can jump from culture to culture, right? So all of a sudden, Christianity in the global south starts to take on some of the nuances of the global south, but it's the same gospel that we experience. And Christianity in the West takes on different nuances than Christianity in the East, even though it's the same gospel. What happens is the gospel gets into a culture and a context, and it highlights the things that are good, it exposes the things that are bad, and it redeems things around it. This is why a few months ago, I was able to visit my friend's Korean church, and I was able to connect with Jesus, and it was amazing to me in that moment. Because here I am, very European looking, right? And I'm sitting in a Korean church, listening to a Korean pastor share about the Middle Eastern Jesus that we both believe in. Like, where does that happen? That's like a gospel thing, right? But he's just as passionate about Jesus as I am. Because Jesus has this way of stepping into our culture and doing something that only God can do and only Jesus can do. So when you step into your culture, you're listening to learn, but you're realizing there's going to be good things about your culture, things that you can highlight, right? There's going to be things that are broken, that just don't look right. And there's going to be opportunities within that brokenness to bring in the redemption of the gospel in a way that allows people to see Jesus. And it's in that unique, redeemable stuff that the gospel starts to shine the brightest. It's kind of those gospel opportunities. So, example, like ways you can do this is you can obviously talk to the people around you. If you're engaging with a community or you're new into a community, talk to some of the people that serve in that community. So, like, if you're a regular at a restaurant, talk to your waiters and waitresses, right? Learn what they experience from people in the community. Talk to people you see in different places. Like when I was in Ridgewood, it was really interesting. Ridgewood's the community I live in. And what was really profound to me is people in and out of the church described my community the same way. They describe my community like this. It's a place that's perfect on the surface. Like if you drive through Ridgewood, everybody's lawn is like perfectly manicured, right? You'll get a ticket if you leave your snow on the ground longer than 24 hours. Okay, it's like one of those spots, right? But they say underneath, it's really broken. So like when you start getting past the perfectly manicured lawns and the nice snow removal and the garbage men that will come into my backyard and take my garbage right out of the backyard, it's pretty awesome. You find out that there's people that are struggling in their marriages. There's addiction issues. There's people that are wrestling with deep issues because they're like, I have everything in this world I'm supposed to have. Why am I not happy? You know, there's all of this kind of stuff going on. But you don't see it at first because it's on the surface. But until I had the opportunity to really connect with my community, I didn't have a language for that. But now that I have a language and a framework for that, I know how I can engage with that, with the gospel. And so that's really what we're doing when we're listening, is we're learning who our community is. And in learning our community, we're developing a deeper love for people, and especially people outside the church, but we're also developing a deeper understanding of who the world around us is, so that when we do come with the gospel, we know the right application for that gospel. Because the gospel is something that is simple, but it is not simplistic. Gospel is something that is simple, but it's not simplistic. And what that means is this. The gospel is simple. It's simple enough for my kids to understand. But it's not so simple that it doesn't have different nuances that apply in different places, right? So like the gospel is not always the courtroom metaphor. You know what the courtroom metaphor is? Like you're standing before the judge, you're guilty, and then he comes in, Jesus comes in, and now you're forgiven. That's the courtroom metaphor, right? Here's the problem with the courtroom metaphor, at least in the culture in which I live, is that we live in a very relativistic culture, a culture where you define your own meaning. And in a culture where you define your own meaning, and it's very relativistic, there is not necessarily a universal morality all the time, right? So this concept of sin doesn't really track for people in my generation and my culture. So if I come in and say, you're forgiven of sin, they're like, what's sin? I'm just learning to be my true self, right? I'm just figuring out my identity. And so that gospel's not going to track. But do you know what else the gospel does? The gospel gives me a true and deep sense of identity that cannot be stolen away from me. Like Jesus literally died and walked out of the grave. Jesus calls me my child, and he calls me his child, not in my best moments, but he does it in my worst moments. Jesus calls me his child when I have nothing to offer him in return. That's radically different than the world around us, right? The world around me is screaming, you need to figure out who you are and your identity. And then you need to live up to and live in that identity. You know, what happens if your identity is work and your boss comes in and fires you? And like one day you got a job and the next day you don't have a job, right? You know, we give professional athletes a really hard time when they have to retire, and we're like, why are they still playing? Like, why is Tom Brady still playing football, right? Why did he give up his marriage to continue playing football? Well, think about it. How old's Tom Brady? He's in his early 40s, right? All he has done his entire life is play football. He's the football player. He's one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time. So who is he going to be when he's not that? What happens when your identity is wrapped up in something that could easily be stripped away, right? In that moment, do you need to look at Tom Brady and go, do you know that you're forgiven for your sins? Or do you need to look at Tom Brady and go, do you realize that you are more than just a quarterback? And that God loves you in spite of that? And that you are just as much God's child when you're not the quarterback as you are when you are the quarterback? Like, that's the gospel. Big time. Like, I'll share one more example with you. You know, recently when we stepped out to do this network thing, I had to leave my job to be able to do it. And so I went from the sole income earner, right, to the not income earner. And my wife was, which is really cool. I went from the one that worked all the time to the one that was home with the kids all the time, right? And as I was starting to build things back up, I would have these moments where I'm like, I should really get another job. And I would go on LinkedIn and like search LinkedIn and stuff and, you know, put out there that I'm an MDiv, which apparently doesn't translate in a lot of spots. It's good some places, not LinkedIn. And so one day I'm sitting there talking to my wife going, well, I think I'm going to apply for this thing over here. And she goes, why are you doing that? I go, you know, so I can make some more money. And she goes, why do you need to make more money? We have enough money. Like, we're doing okay. You need to keep doing what you're doing. She said, do you know why you're doing that? You're being prideful. I was like, ooh, touche. Like the thing only your wife can tell you, right? And you know what I realized? I realized that I needed to make some money because my identity was in that. Because I was the husband and father that had the benefits and brought in the income and supported the family. But in order for me to do what God wanted me to do next, I had to learn that it was okay to not be that and to just be Matt, child of God. So like gospel is so important and it's so multifaceted. And when you're talking identity, you're just talking about one aspect of the gospel that connects with a really big pain point our culture's dealing with. And that happens in so many other ways. And so I'm not saying that you have to go out now and trade the courtroom metaphor for the identity metaphor and tell everybody you meet about their identity in Jesus. What I'm saying is when you listen to the world around you, God will show you how the gospel can fix the brokenness around you. And it will nuance in very powerful ways. So that's why it's so important for us to listen. So, really quick, let's take some time to talk around our tables, right? We have our same questions here. What stuck out to you in this session? Number 2, what challenged you? Did you hear something in the listening to your community that challenged you? And then finally, what would it look like for you to put some of that into practice? So take some time and just talk amongst your table.